Hello, everyone. Everybody's coming on in right now, and thank you for joining us for our Classics Revisited webinar. We are so happy to be continuing this great conversation and providing a work break with more great titles of our world.
Oh,
Hi, Michael. How are you doing today?
Hi. How late am I?
Oh, you're not late. We're just getting started. So go ahead and just sit back, listen to your lecture, and we'll join you again at the end of the lecture and get you going.
You. I'll turn off my audio.
No worries.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Today we are continuing down the dystopian bubble and listening to Professor Michael Sugrue's reflections on A Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. I always mispronounce his first name. We're going to give everyone just a few more moments to log in and get settled. While we do that, please set that chat panel to make sure you're sharing with all attendees and panelists. And why don't you let us know where you're joining from today? We'd love to hear from you. Also, how the weather is. I'm up in Minnesota and it has been record hot already this summer. So I'm not necessarily looking forward to the rest of the summer up here. But once again, we'd love to hear everything and where you're joining from around the world. Often said to be ahead of his time, Huxley published Brave New World in 1932. Brave New World depicts a simple, lighthearted, and perfectly content society that through one person begins to debate the incompatibility of happiness and truth. We are looking at today's webinar as a give and take discussion about Brave New World and would love to hear all of the questions that Dr. Sugrue's lecture may inspire. There we go. Didn't want to advance for me there for a moment. Today, I have that great pleasure to welcome back Dr. Michael Sugrue to our ongoing webinar series, Classics Revisited. Dr. Sugrue is a professor. He is a graduate of the Great Books program. He earned his BA in history from the University of Chicago and his MA, Masters of Philosophy, and Ph.D. in history from Columbia University. Professor Sugrue has taught at prestigious universities such as Princeton, Columbia University, Johns Hopkins University, and many more. My name is Christy Goebel. I'm the Global Marketing Specialist here at Bibliotheca, and behind the scenes we have my colleague Kenzie Corain helping to make sure everything runs smoothly. We will be sharing the chat log with all attendees as part of our ongoing sharing. So make sure you do switch your settings to all attendees and panelists so that everybody can see any questions or comments that you may have. If you have specific questions, please use the Q&A panel. The like button does help float the most popular questions to the top, so please use that feature if you see similar questions or something you just want answered. Once again, we are looking at today's webinar as a give and take discussion and would love to hear the questions that Dr. Sugrue's lecture may inspire. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to the professor. Just once again, we have pre-recorded his lecture and then he will be joining us again live at the end to answer all of those great questions. So Michael and I will go ahead and turn off our cameras and we'll get the lecture started. Thanks so much.
Aldous Huxley's Brave New World is one of the great dystopian novels of the 20th century. It was published in the interwar period, 1932, and it is an extremely insightful critique of a certain tradition of moral and political thinking that was primarily centered in the English-speaking world. This is utilitarianism. Utilitarianism states that we should be guided in our legislation and in our morals by the principle of extending the greatest good to the greatest number, where good is understood to be pleasure and evil is understood to be pain. Okay, what Aldous Huxley asks is, what happens if we were to achieve such a goal? In other words, suppose we were to reorganize society in such a way as to maximize and optimize the distribution of pleasure to everyone within the society. We would also minimize the experience of pain. Well, he is proposing that, I don't know, 600 years in the future, this would be the year 2540, we are sufficiently technologically advanced so that it's possible to actually provide maximum pleasure to all people. And society is run as a gigantic pleasure-producing machine. And the purpose of life is to produce generation after generation. And this generation is, in each generation, is tasked with producing the next one and consuming as much of it as they possibly can in order to keep the machine running. So they produce and consume, produce and consume. They work, and they're expected to behave like adults there. But after work is over, their two main activities are soma and sex. Soma is a kind of drug that produces enjoyable sensations and feelings. It doesn't destroy the health in any obvious way. And so people are constantly somatified. In addition to that, they are encouraged to consume pointlessly complicated kinds of leisure activities like obstacle golf. All right. And the idea is that they are constantly consuming at a very high level, not just things, but people. And the inhabitants of the brave new world all engage in roughly indiscriminate sex. And the result is a collection of atomized individuals who are also largely cocooned from real experience. It's a little bit like the title of that Pink Floyd song, Comfortably Numb. Life in the brave new world is a life of comfortable numbness. Into this mechanized and dehumanized world is thrown Mr. Savage. And Mr. Savage, although his mother and father also had lived in the developed world of Brave New World, he himself was raised on an Indian reservation, which is now what we call New Mexico. He was raised there because his mother got separated from a group, became pregnant, which at this time is no longer done. This is due to the fact that all of reproduction in the Brave New World, in the industrialized world or post-industrial world that is found back in London, all reproduction is done mechanically by splitting eggs very early on, sort of genetic engineering, which produces clones, and everyone is born after being decanted from a bottle. So Mr. Savage has not had the conditioning or the environment growing up that everybody else in the Brave New World has had. Now, Bernard Marx, a kind of malcontent, and his girlfriend for the moment, Lenina Crown, they go to New Mexico, they find Linda and Mr. Savage, and they bring them back. Now, you have to remember that back in Brave New World, society is not egalitarian because people's capacities are not identical. They are rated on the basis of their mental abilities, but they don't get any special pleasures on the basis of their mental abilities. Everybody gets all the sex and soma they can handle. The alphas, particularly alpha pluses like Bernard Marx, have jobs that require more intellectual ability and creativity. The further you go down the Greek alphabet, down to the gammas, the further you go down in intellectual ability. So each of the castes is raised in a hypnopadic environment, which means that when they go to sleep, they have their ideas formed by the not quite, but close to infinite repetition of the same few thoughts. These few thoughts will seem to everyone like common sense, like an inevitable and obvious choice. And the reason why is because everyone has been programmed essentially to see it that way. So this renders the inhabitants of Brave New World very predictable, close to being automata. And Mr. Savage is eventually going to object to being a robot. He doesn't want to be a vessel for the collection of pleasant experiences. He wants something more like human life as we understand it, with its inevitable ups and downs, its hopes, its aspirations, and yes, even its pains and its troubles and its worries, because this is what gives us depth, complexity. This is what cures us from the danger of numbness. And I have a friend who's a doctor, and he once said that pain isn't nearly as dangerous as numbness, because numb patients can't tell the doctor what's wrong. So Mr. Savage, having grown up on a New Mexican Indian reservation, has only read a science book and also the complete Shakespeare. And the complete Shakespeare transports him. And there's much funny badinage regarding Shakespeare and Shakespearean quotes, often mangled, that are trotted out in the course of the novel. The title, Brave New World, comes from Miranda's statement about the enchanted island in The Tempest, "O brave new world with such people in it." What Huxley is talking about is the degradation of human life when we reduce human happiness and the felicity of our kind to the consumption of pleasures, to the consumption of consumer goods, to the consumption of sex and drugs. If there's not more than that to life, we live the kind of life that mollusks live, that primitive animals live. And what Huxley is doing through the character of Mr. Savage is pointing out that it's actually not advantageous for people to be strangers to the ordeals and pains of human life. It's not that pain or misery is a good thing, but rather that without some of it, we wouldn't be able to get a perspective on the things that are good. And it's a kind of strange theodicy. Why is the world like it is? Well, because if it were perfect in the utilitarian sense, we would hardly notice it, and we would go through our life sleepwalking. And much of this is revealed in the discussion that goes on between Bernard Marx, who's the kind of impresario for Mr. Savage, and they talk to Mustafa Mond, who's one of the 10 world controllers. And in this technocratic state, it is a sacrifice that he is willing to make to keep almost everyone ignorant of the things he likes, which is not just Shakespeare, but the Bible. And the reason why he does that is that it would make a mess of their lives and make a mess of society. Now, what he's done is accepted the proposition that pleasure and pain are the same thing as good and evil. But he's accepted it for other people, not for himself. He himself allows for the richer experience that comes with an understanding of the whole gamut of our possibilities. And that's something he strangely has in common with Mr. Savage. Now, he eventually, Mustafa Mond eventually exiles the two alpha pluses that have been introduced. That'd be Bernard Marx, who's the finder of Mr. Savage, and also Helmholtz Watson, a frustrated writer. And they get sent to islands which is where all nonconformists and malcontents get sent, so they don't pollute and cause trouble with the static consumption of pleasure that we get back in the Brave New World. Helmholtz Watson wants a bracing cold climate. He asks to be sent to the Falklands. Bernard Marx is more of a wimp. He begs not to be sent, or at least not to be sent immediately. And he's a rather pathetic character. Now, the most pathetic character in this rather dark novel is Mr. Savage. His mother dies, and he is shocked to see that young children are brought into the dying ward, because all human beings are genetically engineered to die at about 60. They very quickly collapse physically, and they're kept on constant Soma until they're dead. But children bring their toys in there because the children are being conditioned not to fear death. And that Mr. Savage finds this appalling. He is deeply hurt by the spectacle of his mother's death, but the juxtaposition of that with happy playing children, a lack of solemnity, is such that he becomes enraged. He becomes enraged also when a lovely young woman, Lenina Crown, makes sexual advances to him. He finds her attractive, but he finds her promiscuity incompatible with his Shakespearean notions of love. And the Shakespearean notions of love are, in fact, more valuable than the kind of free and easy, but ultimately meaningless interaction that is characteristic of the sex in Brave New World. No emotional charge to it, primarily a physical impulse. Now, Mr. Savage refuses to play along. He can't get out of the Brave New World, but he can't be part of it either. He lives an isolated life in a lighthouse, which causes people to flock there because such antisocial behavior is weird and strange, provocative. And Mr. Savage is so disgusted with the world he's immersed in that he becomes especially conscious of his own sinful nature, an idea which is completely alien to the Brave New World. And then he becomes a flagellant. He starts to beat himself to the point of drawing blood, like one of those medieval flagellants. And this excites and thrills the population because it is picked up by television, and vast crowds gather to watch him hurt himself. The idea of self-harm, unimaginable in the Brave New World. And the spectacle of a man beating himself is so exciting that his solitude is destroyed, his happiness is destroyed, his life doesn't seem worth living. And so at the end of the novel, Mr. Savage hangs himself in despair. But it's also a protest against the idea that what's good for human beings is the satisfactions that we have in common with lower animals like clams. There are satisfactions, pleasures, if you want to call them that, like creativity or construction or affirmation or generosity or benevolence that don't fall into purely hedonic calculation of good and evil, right and wrong. So what Mr. Savage is doing is giving us a warning that there's more to life than pleasure. There's more to politics than optimizing the extent of pleasure. And that there's a complexity to human life that in some way even redeems and justifies the downsides and difficulties of it. And that's something that's very hard to shoehorn into a utilitarian calculus. And that's why Huxley is one of the most intelligent, one of the sharpest social critics of the 20th century. Sex and Soma sounds like, I don't know, Saturday night in most American cities, but it may not be restricted to America either. That being said, this is a book well worth reading and well worth pondering. It has a lot to say almost 100 years later.
All right. Thank you so much, Michael. And yep, if you could join us, that would be great. How are you today, sir? Good morning. So I have to say, as people start filling in some questions into the Q&A panel, like this has been on my bucket list for years, but it was one that was not required in any of my schooling in high school or college. And so I did check it out from the library and read it preparing for this lecture. And let me tell you, I'd listened to your lecture when we recorded it, so I kind of knew what to expect, but I have like questions upon questions. So I'm hoping that our audience has more questions so that I can focus on them instead of not, because I get you at other times that I can always do some follow-ups. But
it's a very stimulating book.
It is. And the one thing I want to go, like, not specifically on the book, but I realized as I was reading this, so this is our, I want to say, third dystopian that we've done. We kind of focus on dystopian and political thinking in this first 6 months worth of things. We did 1984 back in February. We did A Clockwork Orange, and now we did Brave New World. And I want to say that one of the things that came to mind when I was looking at dystopian novels is their importance in writing. And I had to go and look it up because I always thought dystopian a little bit more of a, 20th century into the 21st century, really kind of, ramping up in the 20th and 21st century. But really, dystopian novels could be dated back to, the 18th century if you consider Gulliver's Travels by Swift, a dystopian novel, which from some of the articles I read is one of the first ones a lot of people will attribute to a dystopian world. But, we've had massive popular series like The Hunger Games in recent times. So I guess my question for you is, why do you think people really seem to be more apt to write and read about a dystopian universe than a utopian universe? And does it come, with asking with the Brave New World, which is kind of a mix of both, depending on what you're looking at?
Well, yeah, that's a very interesting, very complicated question, but I think that there's a certain sort of cultural pessimism that enters the West. I would say starting around the end of the First World War. So about 1919, people look around at the wreckage of Europe and they lose faith in progress. It looks to them like the Enlightenment has been oversold, which it has, because 200 years earlier, we were told that reason was going to solve all of our problems. Instead, reason gets employed to produce mustard gas and machine guns. So there's a flight from reason.
Mhm.
And that pessimism is found in novels, but particularly in novels about politics. Very few optimistic views of politics associated with this decline in the significance of reason.
Yeah. It's just an interesting look. And one of the things that I read, and it's an article that Mackenzie, if she hasn't shared it yet, can definitely share it with you, with our audience, is, if Brave New World is dystopian or utopian, because it also goes to who's thinking that way. Because most dystopian novels that I've read, or stories I've read, including Brave New World, is the controllers of the current metric or the current world think they're doing right, think that it is the correct way to go, which I suppose is true for any government even today, when we're neither in utopia or dystopia, depending on how you look at it, or which perspective you're taking from it. One of the comments that we had here was, I feel like Huxley projected too far into the future at 2540 and could have settled it right in 2020 with how certain things are looked at. So it's just a interesting thought as to whether or not Brave New World is dystopian or utopian, depending on whose perspective you're looking at.
Well, you're right. Um, there are people, well, look, if you're committed to the idea that what's good for human beings is the firing of certain synapses and neurons, which is what
Mhm.
pleasure amounts to, then what is good for people is something they share in common with animals that I wouldn't want to trade places with. The
Yeah.
ancients used to say, it's better to be Socrates unsatisfied than an ox satisfied. And I kind of feel that way about mollusks too. Much as I admire them, I'm told that some clams can live to be very, very old. And I suppose that if it was in the right location, siphoning food from the water and that kind of thing, maybe it's really content and happy. I wish it more content and happiness. But for myself, I'd like something more than that.
Hmm.
All right. And that's the sense in which to me, it seems very eerie that someone say, I can't tell if this is a dystopia or a utopia. Well, um, what they're trying to do, what Huxley is trying to do is to provoke you into rethinking what
Hmm.
your idea of human happiness or felicity, what the human good is. All right.
And,
Yeah.
and I do like the conversation between John the Savage and the controller at the end of the book, in the sense of, it really does go into the thought of, like, without pain, without tragedy, without human connection and relationships, can you actually feel true happiness? And it goes to your lecture too, in the sense of, like, numbness versus pain. It would almost be better to have pain over numbness, because at least then you're feeling something.
Yeah. Dostoevsky, my favorite novelist, once said, suffering is the origin of all consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
And that's an amazingly sharp line. Uh, Notice that when you just reflect back on your own life, the things you remember that stick out in your mind are often the things that are painful.
Mm-hmm.
So pain gets our attention, and sometimes it can reorient us. And sometimes that reorientation is a good thing. All right. It doesn't mean that we're not making the best of a bad situation. It means that even a bad situation is not exclusively bad. And I think that's what the utilitarians fail to grasp. You need a bit of contrast in order to be able to comprehend what a great time you're having with sex and Soma.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. I've taken enough of your time. We have so many great questions coming in. So I'm going to flip over to them and ask some of these questions coming in from our audience. Keep them coming for sure. Do you feel that Brave New World is intentionally or incidentally anti-capitalist? Do you feel the Depression had a shaping influence on Huxley's social views?
I don't see it as being especially anti-Catholic. I see it being
Capitalist, not Catholic.
capitalist. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, anti-capitalist.
No,
Well, no. In some ways, he's tipping his hat to the industrial process unleashed by capitalism. Remember, we organize our time around the activities of Henry Ford. This is the year of our Ford. So, the question he's asking is this: capitalism is a constantly self-revolutionizing economic system, right? It drives itself to create economic growth. What he wants to do is ask the question: look, 500 years from now, when we have more stuff than we know what to do with, what do you want us to do then? Produce more stuff that we don't know what to do with? And that's a fair question. Suppose we get to the point where everybody has food on the table. I think that's a good thing. But the question is that it? Or do we just want to tinker with their sex lives? Or do we want to offer them something more? Some big human project that separates us from mosques?
Okay. But with that, one of the questions that I had as well was along the lines of, if we, I found it very interesting. One of the comments, and it actually came up. I'm not going to go into it. I'm a huge Stephen Colbert fan, and he was on with Jon Stewart last night talking, and it was kind of ironic that I was finishing the book at the same time, because one of the things that Jon Stewart had said was something along the lines that eventually science is what is going to cause the end of the world, because we just keep going the next step over. Whereas a lot of the discussion that was happening between John and the controller was along the lines of like, we can't keep looking for more. We can't keep improving, because eventually knowledge and truth is what's going to cause, everything to, become unstable and crash. And so they stopped knowledge base. And so what do you make of that? If like eventually capitalism, communism, totalitarianism, whatever, like, can they control when we stop thinking further so that we don't push humanity to the next level?
Well, this is the problem of Greek heroism. Superior people push the envelope. The problem is these superior people are just as flawed as everybody else. And when they push the envelope long enough, they end up tearing the envelope. But you don't realize that you crossed the line until you're on the other side of the line, and then it's too late.
Yeah.
Right. So the question about science, well, it's a good servant and a bad master. If what we want to do is provide for the necessities of people, that's a very good thing. I agree with the utilitarians there. My problem is, though, what do we do next? And we're told, well, we're going to have liberty. Liberty for who to do what, right? And well, liberty to do all kinds of things. Well, I have misgivings about that, because of God knows what's included in all kinds of things. On the other hand, the idea of having some large trans-individual project, like say exploring the frontier at one time, but now it would be exploring outer space. There's plenty of room there for everybody. And so it's possible for us to find projects like, say, the Apollo project, which is a grand human activity, which aspires to more. And notice in the discussion here, we've heard a lot, of Huxley. We hear a lot about knowledge and a lot about reason and a lot about science, but we never hear about love.
Yeah.
It's a loveless world where everyone's there primarily interested in, their own sensations. And that means it's a very isolated, lonely world. And that's what weighs on Mr. Savage.
Interesting.
Good.
No, like I said, I have a million questions that were coming to mind while I was reading it. So one of the questions that came in that a couple people want answered is, why do you feel there were age limits put in this book and in other dystopian novels or movies like Logan's Run? What is the purpose of these types of age limits?
Well, one is the inevitability of human finitude. That's one of the messages of Greek tragedy, right? So, although we may desire and get an extension of time, there's no infinite extension of time. And so, sooner or later, you're going to deal with mortality, whether you want to or not, and regardless of your technological sophistication. What is it, the line from Shakespeare? Golden lads and girls all must, as chimney sweepers come to dust. That's the way it works.
Okay. Moving to the novel itself and and the author Huxley, what kind of response do you know that this novel actually received in 1930s? Obviously, it's become a classic that a lot of people reference again. Actually, just was made into a new series last year on Paramount. So, what was its original reception?
Well, it got mixed reviews initially. The attack on utilitarianism was obvious, but in the 1930s, partisan political passions ran very high, and and it was largely ruled by the loudest, and the people on the fringe, on the far right and far left, especially intellectuals, had misgivings about Huxley's novel because he seems to be saying that there is no silver bullet, that the best you're going to get is a flawed utopia. And in the 1930s, both the far right and far left are selling 100% utopias. They're not selling a recognition of human limitation. Both the far right and far left in, say, Germany in the 30s were extremely Promethean. They were going to stand up and save humanity from its debased condition by reorganizing global politics, either around class or around race.
Well, I know that the two we've done both of them here. They're compared quite a bit. Actually, I found an article or a video that if it hasn't been shared, Mackenzie has it, of Intelligence Squared, which is of course a PBS and NPR put on there, was the Brave New World versus 1984. Mm-hmm. And these were written only about 16 years apart, in two very different times in a very changing 20th century, in a very changing world for sure. But I found it interesting that in the 1930s, where we were still in a world depression, probably the beginning of it in 1932, but still in it at that point in time, stuff in Europe was definitely starting to get a bit more, the ripples were going on what was happening in Europe. But Huxley still developed this very utopian-esque picture, obviously a dystopian, like not perfect, but very much like happiness, and we're trying to give the world all happiness. Whereas 16 years later, Orwell's take on it was completely different in how the controllers were controlling the world and what was going on. Can you speak to that at all on the comparison of those two?
Well, in some ways, I'd be tempted to say that after the Second World War and the disclosure of things like the death camps and the use of atomic weapons, there was a kind of spiritual bankruptcy. There was not only a lack of optimism, but a lack of a sense of the future at all. And it seems that technology had gotten out of hand and was now causing more evil than it prevented. strangely enough, I mean, I can see why Orwell might think that, given that he's looking at, say, Stalinism.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, it's not surprising that he thinks that technology is going to become an end in itself, and it will more than empower these totalitarian regimes. In fact, if you look at what's happened recently in America, let's say in the last 10 or 15 years, the rise of the cell phone has produced more than selfies. It's produced all kinds of useful things, particularly with regard, for example, to policing. Rather than being hegemonic or enslaving, technology has turned out to be enormously empowering, because now everybody is a news producer. And regardless of whether you're a plausible witness or not, if you have the video, the deal is done. So in post World War II, Orwell is scared of technology, and he has a right to be. If you think about the growth of surveillance technology, particularly as a result of COVID, there's real danger there. On the other hand, few people seem to have found the liberating aspects of technology. Although Huxley is more optimistic about technology, this is a kind of surface optimism, because what he says is that most of us can, if we wish, live the same kind of life that plankton do. All right. Yeah. And he fears that a big chunk of society would be happy to, become plankton.
Okay. Interesting. Moving to another question from an audience member. Why do you think Huxley reconsidered his first edition to be literally imperfect in the foreword of the second edition? Was the difficulty to deal with the negativity of writing a dystopia and how society would deal with it? There's also a lot of interviews from Huxley about how he perceived his novel at first and moving forward throughout time.
Well, there's a saying that no literary work is ever finished, it's only abandoned, right? If you ever tried to write fiction or nonfiction, no matter how disciplined you are, nobody can resist the temptation to mess with it.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what I always used to tell my students. Look, get your paper done early so that you can mess with it in a fruitful way. So my sense is that Huxley felt the same way about Brave New World. It was the most controversial of his books. Mm-hmm. And over time, it became recognized for the classic it was, because of the important questions it asks and leaves unanswered. What do we want besides pleasure? Here's something worth thinking about. If rationality tells us that we want pleasure and only pleasure, then rationality is a means that tells us how to get things. Like, if you want a hamburger, go to McDonald's. If you want a book, go to the library. Perhaps, though, reason is more than that. Perhaps it doesn't just tell us what means to use to get our desires. Perhaps it can tell us what's worth desiring. And that's the interesting question. Can reason tell us about ends, not just means?
I like that. Moving back to science a little bit, because that is definitely a huge key factor through this book, as one of the questions that came in is, if science is now producing gain-of-function viruses, and Soma is realized in weed and antidepressants and other mood-altering drugs, suicide rates are on the rise, sex is no longer confirmed to marriage or even committed relationships. What is the cure? Does the author offer a solution? Was the author a religious man?
Well, he was not a religious man, although he was what I would call, he was someone that wanted something more than nature, something more than physical reality. That's why he used to like to play with hallucinogenic drugs, right? He used Soma, or his version of it, which would be mescaline, for the real cactus mescaline that comes from the desert Southwest. He did that more than once, so he tripped. And on his deathbed, he had, I was told, a dose of mescaline administered to him. Now that's
Okay.
somebody who's on a trip
Yeah.
from which you don't come back. So he's trying to get out of the straitjacket of material reality. And if he can't do that in some spiritual way, in a software way, the next best thing is to do it in a hardware way. That's what intoxication is. It's synthetic religious experience.
Okay. Well, and I know in the novel, they got into more of a religious discussion too, and I found that was very interesting in the sense of like the fact that the controller, one of the 10 in the world that's basically creating these societies, is basically saying that he could believe in God. Like he was never fully specific whether yes or no, but it was leaning towards yes, and that God changes with man. But wouldn't that, in a sense, also, which I can see some of Huxley's not necessarily being a religious man in the sense that, you know, there's always the discussion, man created God, so therefore God is in the image of man. And so as mankind evolves, changes, adapts, therefore God does too. And is that kind of what the controller was talking about in the presence of God in the society?
It's very open-ended, right?
Yeah.
The advantage the controller has is not religious faith. He's not Saint Augustine. The advantage the controller has is that he is allowed to ponder the question.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
That's
A
true, because he knows.
dangerous question: does God exist? And if you let whole societies do that, people will take different views, and that is often a prelude to violence. So he said, "Look, this is like 100 proof whiskey. We don't give this to the children." So he and the other world controllers might do shots and might at least speculate as to whether God exists. We don't dare allow the mollusks that we work for. In other words, you imagine one person at something like aquaculture growing oysters. I mean, he sits there reading the Bible and everything else is a mollusk siphoning water. So his advantage is that he's allowed to ask questions, not that he has any particular answers. But he says, look, if you want to read stuff that will blow you away, Shakespeare and the Bible are actually great places to start. And here I'm not trying to proselytize for Christianity. I'm just trying to talk about culture. There's so much going on in the Bible that is well worth a read, regardless of what your religious beliefs are. In the same way, and for the same reason that other great religious texts, like say, the Ramayana, well worth reading. And only the world controllers are allowed that luxury. So freedom of thought is the ultimate luxury.
Yeah. So this goes, one of the questions that came in goes to something you and I were talking about a little bit earlier, but it is a good thing. And it's something that I definitely thought about as well. And to what extent is the message of this novel that one man's pleasure is another man's pain and vice versa? It goes to that idea of perspective on, is this a utopia, dystopia? Like what's happiness for people? If they don't know pain, then what they're feeling to them is happiness, correct?
Well, to them is the big point. Is happiness subjective or objective?
Mm-hmm.
And that's an interesting question. I don't know what even would count as evidence exactly. That's what makes it tough, right? So I would be inclined to distinguish between happiness in two senses. Happiness in the sense that a person internally believes themselves happy, and then happy in the external way in which we ordinarily describe human events and human behavior. Now, it's possible that there can be a discrepancy here, but the discrepancy is always a problem, is always problematic for social life. Mm-hmm. So a good example would be Roman persecution of Christians. The Christian martyr may have thought, well, I'm dying, but I'm dying because Jesus wants me to, and I go on to heaven. The Roman who's killing him may say, that looks really bad to me. Anybody that says that this is a good condition to be in must be crazy. Well, I can see how there would be an irreconcilable difference there. On the other hand, as a general rule, when people give reports that they are doing, that they're either thriving or not thriving in a way that's inconsistent with what everybody else thinks is thriving, usually that's bad. So if you wanted to look for an objective standard of happiness, you might say it's something like, well, what gardeners do with roses. Gardeners know there are certain conditions under which roses flourish. There are other conditions, like, say, planting them in Minnesota in January, which is not good for roses. So, although there are spectra rather than particular points, we know in a broad general way what makes what it is, say, in the raising of children that's good for them, which is why we don't let them get raised by wolves, right?
Yeah.
No one would plausibly make the argument that being raised by kind and loving parents is the equivalent of being raised by wolves, right? So we're going to have an inevitable disjunction between internal happiness and external happiness, but I think both are real.
Okay.
There are some things that are good for roses and people. That's objective. There are some experiences in which people would say, I'm having a good time or a bad time, independent of what's going on around me.
All right, I like it. Final question, probably final question, we'll see. But it seems, this is from an audience member, and it's a great question. It seems to me that Huxley's metaphors are of political solutions as pleasure or soma, and the human condition as the pain. And the entire treatise is about the impossibility of finding a solution to pain and encouraging us to embrace and even celebrate pain as the measure of our human existence to some degree. What are your thoughts on this? It kind of goes into the last answer you did.
Marquis de Sade, right? He doesn't like pain for its own sake.
Yeah.
He likes it for what, as a means towards providing a contrast for the other affirmative experiences you have. In other words, I like being able to feel my hands, even though that means that over the course of time, I'm going to feel both pleasant and painful sensations in them. I am not, therefore, going to pursue painful sensations in my hand. I'm not going to hit my thumb with a hammer intentionally. It just means that some pain is indispensable in consciousness. You need that non-vacuous contrast to pleasure. So I don't think Huxley likes pain. I think that what Huxley is doing is saying that there's an incomplete overlap between pleasure and happiness.
Okay.
I think he's probably right about that.
Yeah. So we're approaching the end of the hour. A couple of things that I would have loved to get into further discussion with you that I just want to throw out to the audience as things to look up, is the ending. It was one of the I obviously knew from your lecture, from listening to your lecture, what the ending kind of was, but I found the ending to be very stark and abrupt. You have this great conversation between great in the sense of a literary greatness, conversation between John the Savage and the controller. And basically it ends with okay, we're not going to send you to an island because we need you here. We need you here. But they obviously let him go and live on his own. And he initially starts with this thought process of, I can be in solitude. I can do my thing. And that didn't last very long. No. And then it was just and here's the end. And I remember thinking of this last night going wait, that's it? I was hoping for a bigger revelation. I was hoping for a bigger, I don't know, there's no neat tie in. Obviously the world goes on and the world continues the way it is. There was no change, which I think is partially why I feel there was nothing there. Is that a feeling that a lot of people have? Do you know?
I would think so. I mean, I also find the ending quite abrupt, but abrupt in an undesirable way rather
Yeah.
than the abrupt ending in, say, Crime and Punishment, which is actually makes very good sense. Here, I think that this is a novel of ideas, and after he's spilled his guts with Mustafa Mond, Huxley is at the end of the novel, even though we aren't, right? So now he's got to dispatch Mr. Savage, and he does so in a real salacious way. But I think that it's a shame Mr. Savage didn't get some sort of final soliloquy, right? In some ways, Brave New World would make for a contemporary a great subject for an opera.
Yeah.
I'm not joking, because then you could finish off with some powerful aria of despair, and operatic despair, I mean, works really well, where Mr. Savage says, I can't take this anymore. I think one of the lines that he gives is, I want God, I want hope, I want sin, I want responsibility. I don't want to be a mollusk. Well, he doesn't say mollusk, but the idea is, I don't want to be a mollusk. I want to be a human being with all the ups and downs of that. And so in that respect, I think it's very life affirming, and at the same time, a warning about the dangers of getting what we want. I think there's an old Asian curse which says, may you get everything you desire.
Yeah. Well, and it's like after that particular line from John the Savage, like the chapter ends, and it's the second to last chapter. Obviously, it goes into the final one. But the controller basically said, all right, you know what you asked for. We'll grant it. And like, it's almost like the controller knew that would most likely be the outcome if that's what he wanted in the current society.
The controller is using Mr. Savage purely as a means, not as an end in himself.
Yeah. Okay. The final question, it just popped in, and it has something to do with this, and it's a very interesting one. Isn't the entire work a soliloquy, and the sudden ending a statement of, if my life is programmed and my choices are gone, I'm going to unpredictably exercise my one choice to kill myself?
Yeah. I mean, when freedom has been constrained to the point where you're either a mollusk or you're a corpse, what difference does it make? Suppose instead of mollusks we were growing, say, in our aquaculture, suppose we just had a lab and we grew neurons and we had them fire all the time. It would be the same thing, and it would have the same significance. That sounds more and more like the Matrix, and that's another dystopian view that unfortunately we don't have time to unpack that. But the idea is that anxiety about technology is always displaced anxiety about human nature. We say that science is wrecking the world, but science doesn't do stuff, we do.
Well, with that, thank you so much, Michael. I would have loved to get into more direct questions about the controller and Bernard, but we only have so much time. They're very interesting characters. If you haven't read the novel, I highly recommend you read the novel. Like I said, it's been on my bucket list for 20 odd years, and I was just happy to be able to read it for this. So I appreciate your thought-provoking conversation as always, and we look forward to seeing you next time. If you are enjoying, thank you. If we are enjoying the Classics Revisited series with the professor, we are continuing the series this year with our next webinar being on July 20th with Kant's Foundations of the Metaphysics of Morals, which we were inspired to do after our great discussion about utilitarianism. We have also set a lecture per month for the remainder of the year, so make sure you keep an eye on our website and for the upcoming lectures through December. If you enjoyed today's webinar, Bibliotheca is continually adding to our virtual event lineup. We invite you to view all on-demand and upcoming events online at bibliotheca.com and then navigate to our Insights and Trends blog. We do have a couple coming up near the end of June. Those should be on our website later this week, including a new one from the EDC, the Education Development Center. And make sure you are subscribed to receive webinar updates by navigating to the bottom of any page on the website. Finally, as we finish today, as you pop out, We ask that you complete a quick survey. This is just a really quick get your insights, how you're liking this particular webinar series. If you have any questions, comments, ideas, let us know. We love to hear from you and use your feedback to continually evolve this webinar series as well as others that we offer to libraries around the world. Just a reminder, we do circulate the chat log and links to resources in our follow-up email, as well as the link to our YouTube page that will have this on there by the end of the day today. So keep an eye for those in your inbox in the next day or so. Thanks everybody and have a great day. We appreciate you taking this work break with us.